Rutger Bregman, welcome back to The Next Big Idea.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Your new book, Moral Ambition,
Hmm.
is provocative to say the least.
Yeah.
Even the subtitle packs a punch: How to Stop Wasting Your Talent and Start Making a Difference. When you look around, do you see a lot of people who are wasting their talent?
Absolutely. And it's not just me seeing that. It's scientists seeing it as well. And it's people themselves feeling it in their own lives. So in the book, I quote one study done by two Dutch economists a couple of years ago. And they asked this very simple question to people. What do you think about your job?
Yeah,
You know, what is the social meaning of your job? If you would go on strike, is that a problem? Yes or no? And
yeah,
it turns out that a quarter of the workforce, 25% of all people who are employed currently, think that their job may not be very socially meaningful.
yeah.
So, yeah, that is enormous. It's 5 times the unemployment rate. It's millions of people with often quite brilliant resumes who went to
Yeah.
fancy universities, but really wonder what they're doing.
Right. And you point out that 45% of Harvard graduates go into finance or consulting. In the Netherlands, in your mother country, 40% of college students with top grades aspire to work for consulting firms like
Hmm.
McKinsey and BCG. You describe this as a colossal waste of talent.
Hmm.
What do you have against management consulting firms?
Well, look, let me first say some of my best friends are management consultants or strategy consultants. So I'm not saying they're bad people or anything
Yeah,
like that. But I do think the opportunity costs are enormous. Um,
yeah,
there are a lot of consultants out there who do useful work. I'm not denying that at all. But a lot of these very brilliant people could do so much more if
yeah,
they would focus on something else.
yeah,
Um, we live in a day and age with immense global problems. 15,000 kids die from easily preventable diseases every single day. We have the threat of the next pandemic around the corner. I think
yeah.
we're all worried about the state of democracy, not just here in the US, also in Europe, the rise of the far right. I mean, it can go on for quite some time. And in my view, the most ambitious, most talented, and most privileged people should be working on the world's most pressing global problems.
Yeah.
But that's not the case.
It's interesting. Even the combination of words in the title, moral ambition, is kind of incendiary in an exciting way to me because we don't think of uh, ambition as tending to be moral,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, it almost feels like a contradiction in terms. Is
yeah,
that
yeah.
intentional?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a lot of fun in this book, pissing off a lot of people,
Right.
which I'm apparently good at. So I think there are different ways in which people are currently wasting their talent. So you have people who are neither ambitious nor idealistic.
Yeah,
Maybe they work for Philip Morris, selling cigarettes, which is the most deadly product in the
yeah,
history of civilization. 8 million deaths every year, single largest preventable cause of disease. It's what economists call the sin industries. Gambling is
yeah.
another good example.
Which
Like,
are highly compensated
yes,
industries, which is
yes,
not an
yes.
accident, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got this one study in the book from Swiss economists who have a graph. On one axis you see the hourly wage, and on the other axis you see the morality or immorality of certain industries.
Yeah,
People
yeah,
were asked, like, what do you think about certain industries? And there's this very disturbing correlation.
yeah.
The more immoral an industry is, very often the more you earn.
Right.
So yeah,
Possibly because people need to be well compensated in order to
yep,
suffer through the shame of telling people
absolutely,
like
yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
darken people's lungs for a
Yeah.
living or
So
whatever.
in a way, it's a good thing. You could
Yeah,
even argue like it works as a tax.
yeah.
So it could even be a good sign to see even higher wages in the
Mm,
tobacco industry, because that means that we're doing a good job at shaming the people
right,
who are working in those
right.
jobs. But anyway, that's one form. Like, you're
Yeah,
neither ambitious nor idealistic.
yeah,
We already talked about the other
yeah,
version, right? People who are quite ambitious but not very idealistic.
yeah.
A friend of mine who studied at Oxford University, he always calls it the Bermuda Triangle of talent. So
Mm,
it's consultancy, corporate law, and finance.
yeah,
This gaping black hole that sucks up so many of our quote unquote best and brightest.
yeah.
I would say that a lot of entrepreneurs also fall in this category. Um,
This is bad news for me.
I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you tell me then.
Yeah,
Um, I guess there are always differences, right?
Yeah.
For the book, I looked at all kinds of lists of like what are the best startups, what are the most promising startups,
Yeah.
and you always see examples of people who are doing amazing work, like
Right.
a clean meat company or
Yeah.
like a new innovation that may prevent the next pandemic. I mean, all of that is awesome, but you see a lot of stuff out there. Another
Yeah.
app that will make us addicted to something. That's probably not good for us.
Yeah.
Another algorithm that will help us to click on more ads. There's this famous line from now more than a decade old, someone who worked at Facebook
Yeah.
in the early days and said that the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's also, I would say, an enormous waste of talent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then the third category is people who are quite idealistic, but not very ambitious. And that's really my bubble. So, I come from the political left. A lot of my friends are progressives.
Yeah.
And we like to say things like, small is beautiful
Yeah. Yeah.
and less is more.
Yeah.
But for this book, I've really dived deep into the research. And it turns out that actually more is more.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So if you really want to make a big difference in the fight against some of these huge global problems, yeah, you got to learn how to count.
Right. And
Uh,
you say in response to small is beautiful. It's as if saying achieving little is somehow a virtue.
yeah.
That like you also criticize think global, act local.
Yeah.
That it's an absence of ambition.
Well, another example of this is the environmental movement, where you see this recurring obsession with your own environmental footprint.
Right.
So you have all these modern commandments today. Don't eat meat, don't fly, don't have kids, don't use plastic straws.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you do everything right,
Yeah.
then yeah, you've reduced your environmental footprint to pretty much zero, and you might as well not have existed.
Yeah.
So to me, this is like a death cult with a garbage bin or a recycling bin, right? And you turn
Right.
yourself into a compost heap or something.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's quite clear that in the fight against climate change, we need to be looking for the scalable solutions
Yeah.
that totally transform the way we live and work, and not just have impact on our own little lives, but on millions of people.
I was fascinated by a study you cite by economist Benjamin Lockwood
hmm
showing trying to assess the positive or negative impact that people in different professions have and to the extent to which it exceeds or is negative in relation to their compensation. And they concluded that a corporate lawyer does $30,000 of damage to society each year, a commercial banker more than 100,000. I dug into the original research. They also indicate that teachers contribute up to $100,000 of social value beyond their salaries.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not exactly sure how those calculations are derived, and I'm sure there's a huge amount of variation based on an individual and what they're doing
sure.
for all the
Yeah,
corporate lawyers and bankers who are listening right now.
yeah.
But that's kind of staggering.
These are highly uncertain and I would say quite conservative estimates.
Hmm.
But it is an interesting way of looking how wealth is produced. Economists have this term called the externality.
Yeah.
It's not just about the money you earn for yourself. It's also about, the wealth you create for the rest of us. And indeed, for quite a few high-paying jobs, that is negative. So again, if we go back to the most clear example, someone who works for the tobacco industry, I mean, these people destroy wealth on an enormous scale,
Yeah.
right? It's death and destruction, and like we, the public, we will have to pay for that in terms of much higher healthcare costs.
Yeah.
But indeed, you have other examples as well, where as a European, I'm always stunned by, the judicial culture here in the US. You see
Yeah.
all these ads here in New York. My favorite one is no pain, no gain.
Right.
the,
Right.
the-
Yeah.
all these lawyers who are like, yeah,
Yeah.
let me make money on your suffering or this particular accident you had. And obviously that costs society a lot.
Yes.
The fear of that, anytime you can be sued. So these are all externalities.
Yeah.
Um, I would say that this is actually limited compared to the opportunity cost. So that's another term
Right.
that
Right.
economists have, um, and that's all about what you could have done if you would have chosen another career path.
Yeah.
Um, if we go back to these Harvard kids, 45% of them ending up in consultancy or finance. Just think about how much better the world could have been by now if in the last 20 to 30 years that number would have been 5%, and most of them would have ended up working on some of these big challenges that I just talked about, curing malaria, fighting tuberculosis.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much work to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are very talented people who could get a lot done.
Yeah. There's certainly ethical people in those professions. For
Hmm.
instance, I'm thinking now, my father was a corporate lawyer, but a very kind of ethical, thoughtful man who took on clients that didn't pay him, and
Hmm.
so I mean, there's some people who would say, hey, what we need is for everyone to bring their morality to their work.
Yeah,
But on the other hand, one can make the case that we simply have too many
yeah, yeah, yeah,
management consultants and
yeah,
bankers, and we have too
yeah,
few people who are ambitiously applying their talents to solving the world's problems, and there's an opportunity. The opportunity to do so is therefore disproportionately large,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Can I be a bit blunt
Yeah,
again?
please.
So what you just suggested, we tried that. It doesn't work, in my view.
Yeah,
So we have all kinds of initiatives that are about looking for the moral minimum.
yeah,
Things like ESG, the slogan "Doing good by doing well."
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
always the idea is that you will apply a thin layer of corporate responsibility
yeah,
over a problematic business model, and it's just not good enough. And
yeah,
it's also, in my view, not morally serious.
yeah,
If you look at some of these enormous challenges, like I'm pretty terrified right now what's happening in this country, where you see a very real threat of democratic backsliding.
yeah,
Do we really think that, donating 1% of our earnings is going to stop that? Do
yeah,
we really think that 2 or 3 hours of volunteers work every week is going to stop that? Like,
yeah,
come on. So,
yeah,
moral ambition is not about looking for the moral minimum, it's about looking for the moral maximum,
yeah,
which should be a quite natural thing for entrepreneurial people. Like, if you're building a business, are you always looking for, like, oh, what's the bare minimum I can do? Of course not.
yeah,
You're dreaming big, right? You're like, what's the next big step?
yeah,
And that's the kind of mentality we need in the fight against some of these great problems.
yeah. You have a passage, Rutger, in the opening pages that I believe is directed specifically at me. You write, "You may be thinking, I have kids, I have a mortgage, I'm happy to recycle and eat tofu now and then, but a fundamental transformation, no thanks." You say, "In that case, this book may not be for you. Once you have a labradoodle, a set of cheese knives, or a robot mower, there's generally no going back." Now, I only have two of those three things.
Okay,
I
okay.
don't
Well,
yet
then
have
you
the
can still be
labradoodle, but
safe.
I have the other two, so maybe I'm okay. And I like to think I'm making incremental steps towards greater moral ambition. Um, but compared with many of the extraordinary people described in your book, which we'll get to,
Hmm.
um, I think I'm probably too comfortable and soft. So
Hmm.
I feel the provocation in a healthy way. I will also note, though, that you call yourself out, right? I mean, you've said that you are fed you became fed up with yourself to
Yeah,
some degree, right? And
yeah.
this arose partly out of I think this book arose partly out of a response to the your decades of scholarly work and writing, and the
Hmm.
response to your last book, Humankind. You want to speak a little bit about maybe your own moral shortcomings?
Sure. Well, let me start with that passage you just
Oh,
quoted,
good,
because
good.
like in an earlier version of the book, I had this line saying, if you're past the age of 30, it's probably too late.
Right. Yeah.
Like it's in your teens and your 20s, that's when you make the fundamental life choices.
Right.
And my publisher made me remove that passage because apparently it's not good for book sales. I, I gotta say, I also don't believe in that anymore.
Right. Right.
And honestly, I think I'm an example myself. So
Yeah.
I'm 37. Indeed, I was already past the age of 30 when I had this feeling of being a pretty good example of wasting my talent.
Mm,
I spent a decade in what I like to call the awareness business. You
right.
write articles, you write books, you're featured in the next big idea book club.
Yes.
You provide your opinions while you stand on the sideline.
Yeah.
And what happened is that indeed I had published Humankind, a book I'm still quite proud of, but I did have this nagging feeling that some readers were interpreting it in perhaps the wrong way. So
And can you share the thesis of Humankind,
yeah, yeah,
which,
sure.
by the way, was an official selection of the Next Big Idea
Yeah,
Club?
yeah. Thanks, thanks for that. So Humankind was a book about human decency. I
Yeah.
tried to make the case that humans are not as bad as we often think they are.
Yeah.
And there's an old theory deeply embedded in Western culture that says that civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that
Yes.
below that lies raw human nature, that most people deep down are just selfish.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that that is wrong. So the
Yeah.
book is basically a synthesis of what's been happening in that anthropology, psychology, sociology, history, you name it, in the last couple of decades. And I'm not saying that people are angels or saints or anything like that, but I do think we can be justified in being more hopeful
Yeah.
about who we are.
Yeah.
But then there's also a risk of being a bit too hopeful. So at some
Right.
point, I
Right.
saw some people reading the book Humankind on a beautiful white beach
Yeah.
in Bali or a nice tropical
Right.
island,
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, this is a lovely book. My faith in humanity is restored. And you know what? I've decided to stop following the news. I'm not going to bother anymore. I love my life, and everyone read this book." Do you want me to
No,
repeat that?
yeah, if you
Okay,
would. Yes, sorry, I've
sure.
got to
No,
turn up.
yeah, no
I do
problem.
not disturb. I don't know why. Yeah. That was my Dutch speaking.
Oh,
I'm sorry. As you were, yes. We were in Bali on the beach.
yeah. So some readers were posting photos on Instagram on this beautiful white beach saying, "This is a lovely book. It has restored my faith in humanity. I'm not going to follow the news anymore. I'm not going to worry. I'm just going to be happy." And I was like, "Oh no, I've created a monster.
What have I done?
This is
What have I
not
done? Yeah.
what we want right now. We want people to be super engaged and to contribute as much as they can in making this world a wildly better place." So if Humankind was a warm hug,
Right.
then this book is a cold shower, a cold, refreshing shower, hopefully. But yeah.
And I appreciate that your provocations are bipartisan. You say people on the right are inclined to say that suffering results from not taking initiative, but meanwhile, people on the left tend to blame problems on institutions and corporations, and both can be excuses for not taking responsibility
Yeah,
for what we can do individually
exactly.
to try to solve the world's
Yeah,
problems.
yeah. The quote that I come back to again and again and again in this book is the quote from Margaret Mead. Never
Yeah,
doubt that small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the
yeah,
only thing that ever has.
I love
And
that.
there is so much happening in that quote. First off, it starts with small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens. So yes, individuals can make a massive difference. In the book, I refer to Peter Thiel, the famous
Yes,
venture capitalist, or the infamous venture capitalist, I
yes,
should perhaps say, who's written a brilliant book about entrepreneurship, about how to build a startup. It's called 0 to 1.
yeah,
And in that book, he says, like, every good startup is a little bit like a cult, right? It's
yeah,
a group of highly committed people who have their one big secret that they deeply believe in. And it may be utterly wrong, but if it's right, then they're going to change the course of history.
yeah,
And that's true for better or for worse. So the great abolitionists,
yeah,
I mean, they were a little bit like a startup, like a cult of people who deeply believed in this, what was then a crazy idea, a highly controversial idea in the mid 18th century. But it's also true for some of the worst criminals in history, like the group around Vladimir Lenin.
yeah,
I spent quite some time studying the Bolshevik Revolution, and it almost reminds you of a crazy Silicon Valley startup of people who
right,
have this one crazy, very wrong idea.
yeah,
But yeah, they were willing to fight for it. So the second line of the Margaret Mead quote is perhaps the most important one, where she says, "In fact, it's the only thing that ever has,"
yes,
which is a really uncomfortable message for most of us.
yeah,
She's basically saying there that most people do not change the world. Most
right,
people are herd animals. Most people just live their lives, the way it is expected of them. And this is not just true for, middle class people. It's really true for everyone. So, for example, I've met quite a few rich people in my life, and most rich people are incredibly predictable, very boring. They just
yeah,
do what you would expect from them. They climb a very conventional ladder of success,
yeah,
and then they buy exactly the kind of things that you would expect. Like they buy a car, and then they
yeah,
buy another car, and
yeah,
then they buy a boat. Like it's very, very boring.
yeah.
And no historian would ever want to write about such boring people. But
and,
but then obviously,
and you found this line of criticism you've said to be effective, right? That if you're trying to make a wealthy investment banker
Uh-huh.
uncomfortable or reevaluate their path. That just saying like, oh, you should be saving the world doesn't impact them. But if you say actually
Yeah, 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 yeah,
your
yeah,
path is
yeah.
boring.
Yes, yeah, that hurts them very much. This is what I always say to my friends on the left. They're
Yeah,
like, "Oh, you're such an immoral, greedy banker," and then the banker says, "Look, you're just jealous. You can't keep up." But if you say something like, "Oh, wow, you're so talented. You work at Goldman Sachs, right?"
yeah,
Well, okay, huh? Well, I think I'm going to talk to someone. I suddenly remember an urgent appointment elsewhere, and
right,
that hurts them very
yeah,
much, right?
yeah,
Because we're all scared to death of death, right? That's the most essential
yes,
fact of life.
yes,
We have 4,000 weeks on this planet. A career lasts for around 2,000 work weeks. What we do with this precious time on this beautiful earth, that's the most important philosophical, moral question that we have to answer. And no matter how rich you get, you can't buy yourself more time.
yeah,
And so many privileged people are utterly, utterly wasting their time and
yeah,
living lives that aren't really worth
yeah.
remembering.
And I love this insight that there are so few talented people who pursue radically morally ambitious careers or sets of objectives, that actually the opportunity to have an outsized impact is much larger from a
Hmm.
supply and demand perspective
Yeah,
than it is to go to Goldman Sachs.
yeah,
Not to
yeah.
single out Goldman
Yeah,
Sachs,
yeah, yeah,
you know,
yeah. No,
but
that's what's so incredibly exciting
yeah,
about it. I mean, if you're one of those talented people and indeed you take on one of these great causes, the
yeah,
amount of good you can do is just
yeah,
take someone like Bill Gates, for example. I think
yeah,
he's a really good example of a morally ambitious entrepreneur and philanthropist.
yeah,
He's utterly changed the course of human history.
yeah,
The Gates Foundation has saved millions of lives. Um, and the fact that he's able to do that just shows that the vast majority of rich people do barely anything.
yeah,
Or when they practice philanthropy, yeah, they do super predictable stuff. Like they want their name on a building that's already very well funded, or a museum or a university. They give it to Harvard,
right,
which is
right,
like
right,
you
which
give it
already
to
has
a hedge
$50
fund
billion endowment.
masquerading
Yeah.
as a university.
Exactly.
um,
Well,
and
it's a good thing though that you decided the book was relevant to people over 35, because I think Bill Gates. I'm not sure what you would have said about Bill Gates as a 35-year-old or whatever. He
hmm
started the Gates Foundation
hmm
later,
Absolutely, yeah.
right? So this
Absolutely,
was a
yeah.
second
Yeah,
mountain
yeah, yeah,
case
yeah.
for Bill Gates.
There are benefits for all age groups. So if you're young,
Yeah,
you've got your whole life ahead of you. You're still about to write the Constitution for the rest of your life. You don't have a mortgage yet. You don't have kids. It
yeah,
gives you an enormous amount of flexibility. But yes, if you're older, you're much more experienced. You have access to certain networks, perhaps some capital.
yeah,
That makes a big difference. So
yeah,
moral ambition is not just about your time and about your career. It's about using what you have, your cultural capital, your human capital, your financial capital, to make a big difference.
yeah,
It's not just about checking your privilege. No, it's about using your privilege.
yeah. Now, if we want to be effective at at changing the world, you point out that there are a number of illusions that it's better not to fall prey to. One,
Hmm.
you talk about the illusion of awareness, and you talk about, which you've spoken to, and you talk about the illusion of purity.
Hmm.
And you say what noble losers is your term, I think, for people who maybe you yourself were a loser prior to
Hmm.
prior to your more recent actions. I don't know if you'd say that, but uh, noble losers suffer from this illusion that awareness and raising awareness is itself an accomplishment,
Hmm.
opposed to actually getting things done. But the illusion of purity, you say, noble losers tend to forget that every successful coalition is a pact among people who disagree on any number of things. We need to, you say, summon coalitions
Yeah.
of people who have diverse opinions
Yeah.
in order to cause change. And this requires getting over these illusions of purity.
Hmm.
This, I thought, was a really interesting point that you make, and one that seems to fly, uh, one that seems to be not necessarily practiced by most activists today.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really simple point. In the fight against injustice, winning is a moral duty. And what feels good can often be quite ineffective, actually.
Yeah,
Um, and in that sense, it's not about how you feel, but it's about what you do or what the results of your actions are for the people or animals that you say you care so much about.
Yeah.
So let me give you a simple example. I think that one of the greatest atrocities of our time, the greatest moral atrocities of our time, is the way we treat animals.
Yes.
We're slaughtering 80 billion animals every year, mostly chickens. And there's a Mount Everest of evidence showing that these chickens are highly sentient creatures that
Yeah.
suffer immensely in these factory farms. Okay, now what do we do about it? We have the whole animal rights movement, and a lot of them have, for 50 years, been shouting, go vegan. And there are a lot of purist vegans out there as well who
Yeah.
will, check every little product they consume. Like, is there a tiny little bit of milk powder in this? And then if there is something like,
Yeah.
they won't do it. And they also obviously shame a lot of people who then do it, especially people in their own community. So
Yeah.
there's no one a vegan hates as much as a vegetarian, right?
Right.
And I think that is incredibly counterproductive and
Yeah.
deeply morally unserious. What the animals, these billions of animals, want you to do, they want you to build effective political coalitions that
Yes.
pass legislation that improve the lives of millions or even billions of animals. They really do not care about how you feel when you consume a microgram of milk powder.
Right. Right.
So that is like a super simple example. Then some would say, but look, haven't the other great movements done this? Like the abolitionists, for example, who fought against the slave trade and against slavery. Surely they were very purist. And I'm like, well, I studied the history of this for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And turns out, no, they were incredibly pragmatic. And
Yes.
whenever they
Yes.
behaved like you do today, they utterly failed. So in the US, for example, you had the so-called free produce movement in the 1830s and the 1840s. These were abolitionists who refused to consume any product that was in any way associated with slavery or the slave trade. It was a total disaster because
Yeah.
it turns out that pretty much every product was touched in some way by the slavery system. A much more effective boycott movement was actually happening in Britain earlier in the 1780s and the 1790s um, when they started boycotting the sugar in tea. Now, what was so brilliant about this? It was
Yeah.
that it was actually a relatively minor ask from people. Oh, you just don't, put some sugar in your tea, and
Yeah.
that's doable, right? Just like buying an Impossible Burger is
Yeah.
a doable ask. But obviously, the marketing potential of this was enormous. Like the British, they love their tea, right?
Right.
And this was a great way to get political attention, to have politicians in Westminster talk about it when hundreds of thousands of people were refusing to put sugar in their tea. So anyway, I really think we can learn from history here. And
Yeah.
one thing we learn is that this purist attitude is most often quite counterproductive.
I love your example of Lee Garchez,
Uh-huh.
who basically, as an animal rights activist, decided to befriend
Uh-huh.
meat producers.
Yeah.
And was extremely effective. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, yeah. So she's someone, as I do, who also deeply believes that animal suffering is one of the great causes of our time. And she had already spent a decade fighting for animal rights, traveling around the globe, but still feeling that she wasn't doing enough. Then she came back to the US and indeed realized that she needed to build a very unusual coalition with the people who were, in some way, the perpetrators in the system.
Yeah.
Because she realized that many of the poultry farmers in the US are also the victims of this system. Most of them live under the poverty line. If they want to quit their job, they can, but then they will have to sell the land that has been in their family for a long time because they're so deep in debt to these huge multinational corporations that are squeezing the farmers just like they're squeezing the animals. And so she befriended one of them, a farmer named Craig Watts, and he agreed to let Leah and her colleagues film in some of these factory farms. Now, this was the first time in many years that footage came out of those farms and
Right.
that the American public could see how their meat was being produced. It's a horrible dystopian
Right.
world that these
Right.
chickens grow in.
Which is why
Mhm.
she found that this meat producer was
Yes.
agreed to let her
Exactly. Yeah.
create this very
So
powerful
they worked together
documentary,
on
right?
this
Yeah.
production, made a video, sent it to the New York Times, went totally viral, and yeah, it was an example of some pretty effective coalition building that then became harder to deny. Right? It's this farmer who's more on the right wing side of the political spectrum and a more progressive animal activist. And then when that comes together, like people realize, hey, there's really something wrong here. If these people agree on it, then. And it actually reminded me again of Attack of the Abolitionists. I spend a lot of time in the
Yeah.
book, as you know, studying the British abolitionists.
Yes.
Not because I inherently like the British, but because they
Yeah.
were much more successful than the American abolitionists. Sadly, in this country, abolitionism was mostly a failure and quite unpopular. And as we all know, in the end, it took a civil war.
Yes.
But even just before the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln really did not want to be seen as an abolitionist. I
Yeah.
mean, that was worse than being called a vegan today.
Right. Right.
But in Britain, it was very different. It became a huge movement. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in it. And one thing they did very effectively was something that psychologists call moral reframing. So the idea is that you have a certain thing you want to accomplish, like, for example, abolishing the slave trade, but you start finding different arguments in favor of it that
Yes.
resonate with a different kind of audience. So normally we would say, like, you abolish the slave trade because it's utterly immoral. Like, you can't treat people that way. So
Yeah.
abolish it. Well, it turns out that in the 18th century, that wasn't super effective. Most people were like, look, this is just normal, natural, necessary. We've always done it this way.
Yeah.
Just like a lot of people talk about factory farming today. So what was necessary was a different kind of argument. What they discovered at some point was that 20% of all white sailors were dying
Yeah.
during these slave voyages. So again, I'm talking about the perpetrators
Yes.
in the system here.
Yes.
And that turned out to be an incredibly effective argument.
Right.
The abolitionists could go to Westminster and say, like, it's our boys dying on these
Yes.
ships. You
Right.
got to do something.
Yeah.
You got to regulate it, right? This is the worst death rate in all
Yeah.
professions. And when William Pitt, the prime minister, heard about this, he was sold. He's like,
Yeah.
okay, let's abolish the slave trade. To us today, this may seem very disturbing,
Right.
but it's one other lesson from history. Usually the right things happen for the wrong reasons. And a
Yes.
smart idealist, a smart activist makes use of that fact.
Yeah. And this is an extraordinary piece of history that I think a lot of Americans, including myself, weren't aware of. That 50 plus years before the Civil War. I mean, in the U.S., we're very sort of myopically focused on
Yeah.
the Civil War as this process of
Yeah.
overthrowing, getting rid of slavery, this horrible history. But it's extraordinary that the British managed to abolish the slave trade
Yeah.
many decades
Yeah.
earlier because of this kind of unlikely and ferocious um, collaboration
Yeah.
between people who don't always agree with each other.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is such a great
Yeah.
detail.
Yeah.
I love.
And
Yeah.
one thing to add, like, some methods that you don't like can actually be really effective. So I'm
Yes.
personally not, an Extinction Rebellion kind of person. I
Yeah.
don't go often to demonstrations. I don't occupy squares.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I hear, some of my friends saying, "Oh yeah, that doesn't work either. Just pisses people off," and throwing paint at a famous painting or something like that. It's just
Yeah.
counterproductive. And I'm like, well, let's look at it as an empirical question. Maybe you're right, maybe not.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of good evidence that Extinction Rebellion protests, and the what is it, the Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg movement,
Yes.
did an enormous amount of good.
Yeah.
It really raised the saliency of climate change, and many entrepreneurs and maybe lobbyists or whatever who didn't really like those demonstrations because it didn't really confirm to their ethics. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or their aesthetics. That's the word I was looking
Yes.
for. Yeah, they actually benefited from it because as an entrepreneur, suddenly you could get more subsidies, for example, for electric vehicles.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's really important to zoom out and to look at it as an empirical question.
Another great example in your book is the story of Rosa Parks,
Hmm.
which was new to me because I thought that I knew that story very well, but this also gets to your point about the importance of being intentional and methodical and kind of inclusive as you think about
Yeah,
the impact on the audience. You want
yeah,
to speak to that?
sure. Well, it's pretty cool, right? That I, as a Dutchman, can explain something about Rosa Parks to
That's
an
right.
American.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect that. But yeah, once I dived into this history, I was also blown away. Like, a lot of Americans see Rosa Parks as this meek, humble, um, almost saint-like figure
Yeah.
who just had this one powerful moment where, just by
Yeah.
chance, she was sitting in this bus. Yeah, people asked her to stand up for a white woman, and she said no, and that was the
She's
spark
a
for.
humble seamstress.
Yeah, exactly. And like everything about that story is wrong. Like Rosa Parks was a very seasoned activist. She was trained in all the methods that the civil rights movement used back then. She went in secret to school in Tennessee for activists. Like she very much knew what she was doing. And she was part of a group called the Women Political Action Group in Montgomery at the time. And they planned the whole thing. And they were just waiting for the right moment.
Yeah.
So Rosa Parks was certainly not the first woman in Montgomery who said no when she was asked to get out of the bus. There were at least a dozen women before her who also said no. But this action group, they were waiting for the right moment.
Yeah.
There was actually another girl, 16 years old, Claudette Colvin, who just a couple of months before Rosa Parks was violently thrown out of the bus. But then they made a very strategic decision to not work with her because she was younger. And a bit later, she became pregnant. And then the leaders, very pragmatic leaders of this movement, realized, that the white press would eat her alive. That she was probably not the right,
Yeah.
a mascot for this whole thing. Then Rosa Parks came along, and then that moment happened. They were like, okay, this is the moment. We have no time to waste.
Yeah.
Initially, the black pastors were reluctant. Even Martin Luther King that Friday was like, "Yeah, should we really do this?" It was the women who really pushed it forward, and yeah, reluctantly, Martin Luther King became the person of that movement. So yeah, it's an extraordinary story of human agency and strategic planning. And the thing that impresses me the most is that Rosa Parks accepted her role as the humble seamstress because she knew that that was
Yes.
what the movement needed,
Yes.
even though she also knew that that was not who she really was. I mean,
Right.
can you imagine how
Yeah.
deeply morally serious you have to be, how deeply you have to care about this cause,
Yeah.
that you would just do that?
Yeah.
Again, very often the right things happen for the wrong reasons, and yeah. I guess a lot of people are already very impressed with the Rosa Parks story, but if you learn about the real story, you're even more
It's
impressed.
even more
Yeah,
impressive,
yeah,
right? And there was an incredible amount of discipline and strategy,
yeah.
and also focus on a sort of singular objective.
You want to achieve results, and
Yeah.
that is really something you see again and again in the civil rights movement of the '60s. Right? It passed, what is it, 4 packages of major legislation, and so many of the big um, law cases as well, Brown v. Board of Education, you name it. Were incredibly successful, and that's one thing that protest movements today can learn. Um, so take something like Black Lives Matter, obviously an incredibly impressive movement. According to some estimates, the biggest protest movement in the history of the United States, like millions and millions of people coming together. But you could say that in terms of the results, like what's the actual legislation that has been passed after that, it has been disappointing, I would say. Um, I mean, awareness is not totally worthless. I'm not saying that. Um, and so that has been a major contribution. But yeah, take a slogan like defund the police. Was that really the best slogan?
Yeah.
Even if you look at communities of color, that was a quite unpopular idea because crime rates are generally higher there. And yeah, I think if you compare that to some of these earlier movements, yeah, it's been somewhat disappointing, and we can learn from the past.
Yeah. And so, do you think that activists in the U.S. and maybe beyond the U.S. in the last couple decades have been too pure in their execution and not mindful of these dynamics you're describing?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
One big difference is obviously technology here.
Yeah.
And that makes it much more difficult to run a movement. Like Martin Luther King did not have to deal with Twitter
Yeah.
or Blue Sky. um, and that is just a very different world that we live in nowadays. But yes, I am worried about the threat of these very purist online social justice warriors who seem to care more about their own moral purity than about actually achieving results.
Yeah.
And as you say, I consider them the noble losers of our time. Oh, we lost the elections again, but at least we were on the right side of history.
Right.
You can say that today about things like trans rights or Palestine. Like a lot of people said we shouldn't vote for Kamala Harris because of trans rights, because of Palestine. Like,
Yeah.
well, are trans people doing better in this country now? I see a lack of moral seriousness there.
For those who are looking for ways to be morally ambitious, there's a question of what cause to support.
Hmm.
And you say that we should look for causes that are sizable, solvable, and sorely overlooked.
Yeah.
Why those criteria?
The challenge is to look as an entrepreneur, to think like an entrepreneur. Um, any entrepreneur that wants to be successful is always looking for the gap in the market because that's where you can make the most money. And I think you can make a much bigger contribution if you indeed focus on these big problems that fall in the triple S framework. So indeed, sizable, solvable, and sorely neglected. Um, so sizable is perhaps most obvious. You don't want to look at the small problems of life, but at the big
Yeah.
ones. So take something like climate change, global warming is a very big problem, right? Threatening billions of people. Is it also solvable? I would say yes, it's very solvable. We've got all kinds of ideas. We've got promising technologies. We've got new stuff that we need to invent. So yes. Is it also neglected? I would say actually less and less so. There
Yeah.
are already millions of people working on it. So one extra person working on it as well, it's going to be a more limited contribution. But maybe if you want to work on climate change, you can look for the most neglected bits of the fight against it. Um, that's why we at the School for Moral Ambition, the organization that I co-founded, we very much focus on the food transition
Yeah.
because we're talking about 20% of CO2 emissions here. But the amount of investment and talent that goes into it is very small compared to, say, clean energy, for example.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a framework basically to maximize your impact, and it's something that's incredibly important to keep in mind if you want to do good. The biggest determinant of the size of your impact is what are you working on. It's not how talented you are. It's not how rich you are. It's not how hard you work. No, it's what are you working on. You can have incredibly talented people working 100 hours a week on, say, fighting ALS. I mean, that's great. I would never say anything nasty about that. But it's a disease, that's mainly people in richer countries suffering from it. If you have the same skill set and, the same philanthropic capital and then use it to fight malaria, you're going to help, many, many more people. So that is incredibly important to keep in mind. Maybe one final thing to say about this. I always call this the Gandalf Frodo model of doing good. So Gandalf never asked Frodo about his passion. He didn't say, like, hey, Frodo, what's your passion? No, he said,
Right.
I'm an old wise wizard. I
Yeah.
thought long and hard about this, and this is at the top of the world's to-do list. You need to do this.
Right.
And that's what we encourage people to do as well. Don't gaze at your navel, wonder like, who am I?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Where's the secret in my soul? No, just find yourself an old wise wizard. Go out into the world and ask, here I am, what can I do? How can I maximize my contribution? That's moral ambition.
Yeah. And taking a step back, you talk about expanding our circles of empathy over time.
Hmm.
And I guess one can, looking at this and talking about, progress made with, for instance, slavery, which
Hmm.
today we consider unconscionable. You point out that in the ancient world, this was new to me. As much as I think you said as much as 75% of the population of the world was enslaved, which
Yeah.
is astounding.
Up until the year 1800, about 70 to 80% of people were in an unfree relationship to their employer. Like there were
Right.
different varieties. You had outright slavery, you had serfdom,
Yeah.
but freedom is not the rule, but the exception in history.
Right, right. So one can look at that history, and we can see these sort of expansions of circles of empathy. Could you describe this process of expanding our circles of empathy, and whether or not we can say that progress is being made?
Yes. So this is a more than 40-year-old idea from the philosopher Peter Singer,
Yes.
also known as one of the founders of the animal rights movement. Um, and he made the simple point that over the course of human history, we seem to have expanded our moral circle from the tribe, of nomadic hunter-gatherers,
Yeah.
to the cities that we moved on, to the nation states, to the big religions that we became a part of. And he sees this as one of the main drivers of moral progress. With, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just after the Second World War as one of our great achievements, the
Yeah.
recognition that we humans all have inherent dignity.
Yeah.
So often, if you look at the moral catastrophes of the past, the simple mistake that people made was not um, taking other people seriously or dehumanizing them and saying like, yeah, right, we deeply care about our people, but we can throw naked women from this particular tribe. Well, we can throw them before the lions in the Colosseum because that's great entertainment for lunchtime, right? Um, or we can, be very ethical to one another, but we can sacrifice children to the gods in certain cases, right?
Right. Right.
And then again, you see the same mistake that's being made. Um, and I believe that there is some directionality in history here, that we
Yeah.
have made moral progress. Now, that moral progress was not automatic and it was not inevitable. People fought for it really, really hard.
Yes.
And we could have lived in a very different kind of world if they would have failed. And that was very thinkable. As I said, it was only the British movement for abolitionism and against the slavery that was really successful. And it's very thinkable that a few people would have fallen off their horse in the late 18th century, and the world could have looked very different today. Um, yeah, it's also quite thinkable, by the way, that actually in the 50s, 1950s, and the 60s, some people fell off their horse, and if they wouldn't have, we wouldn't have factory farming today. um,
Interesting. Yeah.
so that's important to keep in mind. Then at the same time, yes, we have made moral progress.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence to me that many of the first abolitionists then later became suffragettes fighting for the women's right to vote.
Yes.
Because once you start expanding the moral circle, then why stop? And it's also not a surprise to me that many of them already deeply cared about animal rights.
Yeah.
Once you start expanding the moral circle, then why stop? And now in the year 2025, I think we got to continue this journey. Like we can
Yeah.
follow in the footsteps of the moral pioneers who came
Yeah.
before us, and we can ask
Yeah.
ourselves this question: what would the abolitionists have done if they were alive today?
And the implication, I think, is that this expansion of circles of empathy is a collective journey
Hmm.
across history, but it's also an individual one. That as an
Hmm.
individual, as you start to think about you know caring more deeply, you then might think, well, gosh, these animals I've been eating,
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And maybe I should add here that you should not see this process as, growing the size of your heart, for example, feeling bigger emotions, for example, caring deeply about. That's just not how human nature works. There's a fantastic book by the psychologist Paul Bloom called Against Empathy,
yes,
where he makes this simple point that humans are limited, right? Empathy is a limited emotion. It often works like a searchlight, like a spotlight. We focus on those people that are more similar to us, or we focus on the
yeah,
animals that are more cute and cuddly. Like people,
right, right,
people spend tens of thousands of dollars on their dogs while they eat, the meat from pigs that have
yeah,
suffered tremendously, or they even give that meat to to their dogs, right?
yeah,
And that's just shows you the limits of empathy here.
yeah,
I think we need quite some, um, yeah, rationality here as well.
right,
There's a quote from Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, who once said that it's the mark of a civilized human being to be able to look at a row of numbers, at an Excel sheet,
yes,
um, and weep. And that's not easy, but it's something you can learn.
right, right. Which is sort of perhaps a response to, was it Stalin who said
Yeah,
one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so we need to see the millionfold
yeah.
tragedy
It's very
effectively.
hard to internalize
Yeah.
these numbers. In the book, I've got one story about Rob Mater. He's
Oh, amazing character.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, a former consultant, a former manager. He lived a really conventional life, being very successful, studied at University of Cambridge, went to Harvard Business School, became quite wealthy. Um, but then at some point in his career, he was watching the BBC, wanted to switch off the television, but pressed the wrong button on his remote. And then suddenly the channel switched to a documentary about a little girl named Terry who had suffered terrible burn wounds
Oh, yes.
in a
Yeah.
terrible accident. And he was so moved by this documentary. It's still on YouTube. You can't watch it without crying. And he was like, I got to do something. Right? He felt an enormous amount of empathy for this one little girl. So he started this huge swimathon. He encouraged hundreds of people to swim the distance of the channel, from
Yeah.
in
The
between
32
yeah, the
kilometers.
UK to
Yeah.
France, to raise money for Terry. It was super successful. They raised hundreds of thousands of pounds. So like Terry was set for the rest of her life. Didn't have to worry about money anymore. But then the next year, people ask, okay, Rob, what are we going to do? What are we going to raise money for? And then he used his analytical skill set. He was like, okay, well, helping Terry was great, but that's one kid. There are a lot of kids with problems in this world. So he started talking to experts and simply asking them, like, what's the biggest problem that kids face today? And they said, well, the biggest killer of children today is malaria. Back then, it was 1 million people, mostly kids under 5, who were dying from malaria. It's 7 jumbo jets crashing every day. That's malaria.
Yeah.
He then started another fundraiser that was even bigger, the world's first Against Malaria Day. He started the Against Malaria Foundation, which is now seen as probably the most effective charity in the whole world, or at least one of. It's like the Real Madrid of charities.
Yeah.
He totally multiplied his impact. If I've got one graph in the book where it's like Rob Mater's impact, and as a consultant or a manager, it was literally 0. Like he was utterly replaceable. He was doing well,
Right.
but if he would have gone on strike, like someone else would have done his job, it would have made absolutely no difference at all for the course of human history. Then when he did the fundraiser for Terry, like he increased his impact hugely, right?
Yeah.
It made a huge difference for this one little girl. But then the third step, that's the biggest step of all. Because there's one estimate that says that the Against Malaria Foundation has saved at least 150,000 lives. 150,000.
Yeah.
Then in the book, I have this one graph where I just have like all these.
It goes on for pages, right? Several pages. Precisely because of this difficulty we have grokking these larger numbers, which is why your 7 jumbo jets of children crashing every single day is necessary as a thought experiment for us to wrap our heads around what the impact is of malaria.
And then sometimes people say that it's like insensitive to talk about the numbers, or it's not empathetic. I'm like, it's actually super compassionate to care about the numbers.
Yeah.
We have limited resources. We have limited people, philanthropic capital. We're in a state of constant triage. Triage is what doctors have to do in an emergency, a pandemic, for example, where they have to choose, like, okay, which patients are we going to help, and which are going to have to wait for a bit. That's the world we live in, and just denying that, I think that is immoral. I think the moral thing to do is to think about, okay, this is what I have. Where do people need me the most?
Historians, you say, speak disdainfully of chronocentrism,
Mhm.
the naive idea that the time you happen to live in also happens to be especially important.
Mhm.
You are a historian. What do you think of this idea that this moment in history is particularly important?
So I'll go on to say that I think for the time in which we live, it's basically correct. The reason I think this is because you can look at almost any measure of human development and you will see the same shape of a graph. So take something like human population growth, or GDP growth, or the decline of extreme poverty, or the increase in CO2 emissions, or the decline in biodiversity. Again and again, it's the same thing. Like something happens in around the year 1750, and then boom, total explosion, hockey stick, a rocket launching into the stratosphere. And it's the Industrial Revolution. That's the moment when humanity really takes off.
Yeah.
And the ride, this incredibly wild ride, it's speeding up. And now we're living in the era of a new technology, AI,
Yes.
that really seems to be one of the, or maybe even the most consequential technology ever invented. And yeah, it's like we're watching a movie or we're even participating in a movie. The music is swelling, we're
Yes.
nearing the climax,
Yes.
and we get to see how it ends. Um, and it could end very well. We can break through, colonize the Milky Way, build some kind of post AI utopia, figure out the meaning of life, or it could totally crash, or we could build some kind of horrific surveillance authoritarian system um, that will be a shadow uh, of what you know human life could or should really be. So that's that's what I
It's
believe is
right,
happening
and
right now.
as Will McCaskill has said, who was on the show,
Uh-huh.
that this is like the drunk driving adolescence of our species. If we're lucky, we survive it, and we
Yeah,
have a beautiful, untold, hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. But it's a perilous moment. It's a time when we need people who are morally
yeah,
ambitious, which
yeah,
I think
yeah.
is one of the reasons you wrote this
Exactly.
book,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
it's a clarion
yeah.
call,
Even
right?
even more so than in the 16th century or the 7th century. Right? Now is the time when history is so flexible, right?
Yeah,
This is the moment to stand up, to wake up, especially if you have a certain measure of privilege. And I define that broadly.
yeah,
So if you live in a country like the US with a median wage, you're already part of the richest 3, maybe 2% of the world population.
yes,
I think that everyone listening to this podcast is incredibly privileged by
yeah.
historical standards. Just the fact that you have the time to listen to this whole conversation already
Right,
says a
right.
lot about the enormous amount of privilege and power you have. Um, and yeah, you can join one of those small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens that wants to steer the oil tanker to
Yeah,
make sure that we end up in a completely different place. Especially if you're very strategic about the cause you're working on. If you don't start with gazing at your navel, wondering like, oh, what's my passion?
yeah,
But if you just listen to the Gandalf,
yeah.
focus on the most important pressing thing. Yep,
Right.
you can write history.
Yeah, and you describe in the book three looming dangers, with which I think all of our listeners are familiar because we've talked about them on this show. Um, Risk of AI,
Hmm.
existential risk posed by AI, which is a
Hmm.
big concern of mine, nuclear war, and bioengineered viruses, which
Hmm.
unfortunately is exacerbated by AI
Yeah,
already.
yeah.
Um, and you actually you have this wonderful statement that you say all four of the following statements are true. Billions of people and animals are suffering today. We're healthier and wealthier than we've ever been before. The world has the potential to be a wildly better place, and the world's never been closer to its own
Yeah,
demise. How do you
yeah,
reconcile that
yeah.
combination of dynamics at play right now?
Yeah, so this is an adaptation of a great quote by Max Roser, the founder of Our World in Data, and my very favorite website
Mm.
on the internet. And he indeed said, the world is bad. Um, it is really bad.
Yeah, yeah,
15,000 kids die from easily preventable diseases every single day. Lots of animals are suffering immensely. It's still like
yeah,
unacceptable. Um, it's also much better than it used to be. My very first book, Utopia for Realists, that I published a decade ago, the first line of that book was, everything used to be worse. And I stand by that because we have
yeah,
made tremendous progress in the fight against child mortality or extreme poverty. I mean, extreme poverty has really plummeted since the 1980s. Um, and that is really something to be celebrated. In a way, we live in a kind of science fiction utopia, right? With new technologies. We see technologies that help the deaf to hear again.
yeah,
We are deciphering the oldest languages. We're listening to wills and how they speak. It's like
yeah,
we're
yeah,
living in an age of marvels.
yeah,
So the world is much better. But then the third statement is also true. We could do so much better. Like
yeah,
it's so unacceptable compared to the talent we have, the means we have, the resources we have at our disposal, how little we do.
yeah,
The fact that tuberculosis still exists, malaria still exists, the fact that we are utterly unprepared for the next pandemic, that the
mm,
whole world spends
yeah.
only $1 billion a year on researching emerging infectious diseases, which is as much as Americans spend bleaching their teeth. The fact
Right,
that we
right.
spend so much money on utter and total BS. right?
Yeah.
We buy so much crap that doesn't make us happy at all. And we spend so much time in utterly meaningless jobs that also make us deeply depressed.
Yeah.
Um, that is insane. And we could do so much better there.
Yeah.
And then the fourth statement that I would add to Max's summary, which is we've never been this close um, to total extinction, right? Um,
Yeah.
4 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago, we didn't have that power. We didn't have nuclear weapons. We
Yeah.
couldn't engineer viruses. Just take the coronavirus. We still don't really know where it came from. Could very well have come out of a lab. And the next one could be much worse. In the
Yeah.
book, I give the example of the Shrinkio sect in the 90s in
Yes.
Japan.
Yes.
It's really deeply troubling, horrifying story of a sect of some of the smartest young people in Japan at the time who had a lot of money at their disposal. I think the total value of their assets was about $1 billion at the time.
Wow.
Huge sect of many thousand members. And at some point, some of their most radical members started to believe that they needed to start killing as many people as possible because the apocalypse was coming and everyone they would kill today would go on to heaven. Um, so what they did is at the foot of Mount Fiji, they started building this laboratory, this lab that started producing sarin gas.
Yeah.
And they produced huge quantities of it, really battlefield quantities. Now, what's the good thing about this gas is it's not like a bioweapon. It doesn't
Yeah.
spread on its own. They did one infamous terror attack with it in 1995 in the subway in Tokyo.
Yeah. I
And
remember. Yeah.
about, 25 people died, and that
Yeah.
was horrific, but that was it. Now, imagine a cult with $1 billion in assets that is building a lab that
Yeah.
is costed about $10 million. But then with modern AI, you
Yeah.
know, and with modern biotechnology, and the same desire to kill as many people as possible, it's just horrific.
Yeah.
And we need so many more people to work on this. And what's so maddening here is that we have the means and the abilities to make sure that pandemics never happen again. Like the ideas and the
Yeah.
plans are on the table. In
Yeah.
the book at the end, I talk about a young doctor called Jassi Panu, who was one of the co-authors of the Apollo program for biodefense, an amazing bipartisan plan here developed in the United States to basically do an Operation Warp Speed, but then 10 times as
Yes.
ambitious. So not just to end COVID, but to end all pandemics forever. Um, and we can do that with
Yeah.
new kinds of antivirals that are just as effective in treating viruses as antibiotics are in fighting bacteria,
Yeah.
with vaccines for all kinds of virus classes, with far UVC lightning, which is also incredibly promising.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the most important technology that you've never heard of.
Yeah.
It's the idea that we can use the spectrum of ultraviolet light to kill microbes, and it seems to be the case, according to the early studies, that this is not harmful for humans. And yeah, in the future, perhaps we could have those far UVC in LED lights everywhere, and we could clean up the indoor air everywhere, and then viruses would just not be able to spread anymore.
Yeah.
It's so promising,
Yeah.
but at the same time, yeah, you're tearing your hair out when you look at how many people are working on it compared
Right.
to how many people
Right.
should work on it.
Yeah.
And then they go and work for McKinsey. Ah!
Right. Right. Exactly. No, you're calling all bright young people who
Yeah.
with and summoning them
Yeah.
to find their moral ambition to address these issues.
Yeah.
To many listeners, a lot of your message overlaps with the effective altruists,
Mhm.
and you've said that you admire the fierce moral ambition of effective altruists,
Mhm.
but I don't think you see yourself as directly aligned with the EA movement. What's your position?
My book is a study of all kinds of movements that I admire.
Yeah.
So, as I said, I spent a lot of time looking at the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the animal rights movement, and also these effective altruists. And there are things that I really love about them. Indeed, their moral seriousness, their willingness to practice what they preach. And there are things I don't like about them all that much, or at least are not for me. So what doesn't resonate with me is the emphasis on guilt, perhaps, that I see amongst some effective altruists. You
Yeah.
have the famous thought experiment from Peter Singer,
Yeah.
who said, imagine a little child drowning in a shallow pond. Would you save that child if you walk past it? Obviously, you would. But what if you wear your new shoes, very expensive shoes? Well, you still would, right? You'd be
Yeah.
happy to wreck your shoes if you can save one life. But then what if you would donate, a bit of money, about as much as your shoes cost, to a highly effective charity that then could save one life by
Yeah.
distributing insecticide-treated malaria bat nets? Why don't you do that? And then also, why don't you keep doing that? Why don't you keep saving lives until you hardly have anything left anymore?
Yeah.
And suddenly you start seeing drowning children everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, to me, feels like a form of moral blackmail.
Yeah.
That just never really resonated with me. Um, with this movement, we have started the School for Moral Ambition. We said from day one that we want to ground it mostly in enthusiasm.
Yes. Yes.
Just a desire to live a much more meaningful and also interesting life. As we
Yes.
said,
Yeah.
it's not boring, the path of moral ambition. It's much more
Yeah.
exciting, actually.
And I think I think I've heard you say, you think the right ratio is 80% passion
Yeah.
and
Enthusiasm.
ambition,
Yeah.
enthusiasm,
Yeah.
and 20% guilt and shame. So
Yeah.
you think there's a place for guilt and
Yeah.
shame, but your ratio of guilt and shame would be lower. Because at the beginning of this conversation, some of us who own robot mowers and cheese
Sure.
and cheese knives
Yeah.
might have felt a little bit guilted and shamed.
Yeah.
And some of our
Yeah.
listeners perhaps.
There is
but
a
I think
reason.
in the end,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
you see the balances. You really want to inspire people
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
apply their talents in positive ways.
So there's a reason why we humans are one of the few animals in the whole animal kingdom with the ability to blush. We have to use the full spectrum of human emotion here. And I think it's fine if people are motivated by enthusiasm, maybe also by a little bit of guilt, maybe by a little bit of vanity.
Mm.
And maybe that's one of the limits of effective altruism, is it appeals to a smaller group of people, I would say, who are a
Yeah.
bit more nerdy, very rational, or super altruistic. And that's great. I see them like the Quakers of our time. The Quakers who played the leading role in the 18th century abolitionist
Yes.
movement.
Yes.
They were very weird, but also
Yeah.
very, very important.
Yes.
But they really started to make an impact once they started allying with the evangelicals. The evangelicals were much more mainstream,
Yeah.
more charismatic. And yeah, perhaps that's what we need today as well, a movement of ambitious do-gooders that is grounded in more common human motivations.
Yeah. And when you say embrace the full spectrum of human nature, I think maybe this is part of what, cults, I mean, you could say that effective altruism is a kind of cult.
Yeah.
I mean, defining cult broadly, right? Or somewhat playfully. But it strikes me that like part of what cults do or collections of passionate people do is they create an insular culture within which people feel affirmed and high status for
Yeah.
acting in ways that
Yeah.
might be low status in the outside world, right?
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
that we need
And that makes it so easy to
affirmation.
go veggie, for example. Like I live
That's
in a
right.
cult where it's super easy.
Right, right. And it'd be hard not
So
to be, right? Exactly.
you're very welcome to join our cult.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm gonna have a lot to think about. Well,
Yeah.
on that note, let's talk a little bit about balance in our lives. I've always loved the E.B. White quote. I arise in the morning torn between a desire to save the world or
Uh-huh.
savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. Um,
Hmm.
do you give yourself permission to savor the world in
Mhm.
addition to making efforts to save the world?
At the very end of the book, I talk about this question.
Yeah.
When do you do enough? There's always another step. It's never enough.
Yes.
It never stops.
Yeah.
So then you gotta ask yourself the question, like, but then how do I prevent burning out? The reason I only ask that question at the very end of the book is because
Yeah.
I believe a lot of people can do quite a bit more.
Yes.
But yes, if you're starting to do too much, at some point you got to remember your breathing exercises.
Yes.
Thomas Clarkson, he spent 7 years traveling 35,000 miles across the UK and then had a total burnout. I mean, that's probably not good. But
Yes.
let's face it, a lot of people are getting a burnout today while they do work they deeply hate that doesn't contribute much to the world.
Yes.
So if you're going to get that burnout anyway,
Yeah.
you might as well do something useful.
Well, you open the book with a cold shower, as you say, with a provocation, and you kind of end the book with a hug. And I think it's appropriate that we open this conversation
Hmm.
with your provocation and end it with a hug of sorts. You say in the final pages of the book, don't wield this book as a weapon. See the good in others. Demand more of yourself.
Mm.
Um, this resonates for me because I've always kind of thought that we should expect more from ourselves than from others.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, maybe expecting moral behavior from our counterparts is part of the physics of improving the world,
Hmm.
and this is part of what you're doing with the cold shower. How do you think about this question I guess this gets back to
Yeah.
the ratio
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
shame
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
affirmation and
Yeah. Yeah.
enthusiasm.
It's obviously both. So someone who has had an immense impact on me is my mother because
Yeah,
she always expected a lot of me, and that has pushed me, I think,
yeah,
to do better. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, she was once again arrested as an Extinction Rebellion activist. So,
really,
as a 68-year-old woman, so yeah, it's that kind of person. And yeah, she's someone who can be quite critical of me. Also, supports me and admires some of the work I do. But yeah, she's like, okay, Rutger, what's the next thing? Like, are you pushing yourself? Are you getting a bit too comfortable?
yeah,
So I definitely see the power of that. Um, at some point, though, just pointing at others can also become an excuse, and that's something I see a lot among my leftist friends
yeah,
who keep talking about we need to change the system. There's
yeah,
something wrong with capitalism, the patriarchy, all these big words and long essays
yeah,
that seem to me at some point excuses not to do anything yourself.
yeah,
And then we go back to the quote from Margaret Mead: it's small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens that change the world, that change the system. And you can be one of those people.
yeah,
For me, the most important line in the book is about what makes you a good person. Um, I think a lot of us have the implicit assumption that good people do good things. And I think it's exactly the other way around. You do good things, and that makes you a good person.
yeah.
Um,
It's a choice.
the second chapter of the book is about resistance heroes during the Second World War. As a young boy, I was fascinated by this question. I was
Hmm.
obsessed with the World
Yeah,
War and with what happened with the Jews. And I always asked myself this question: what would I have done?
yeah,
Would I have had the moral courage, yes or no, to help persecuted Jews, to give them a hiding place, for example? As you probably know, most of my fellow countrymen at the time in the Netherlands didn't do so. We had the
yeah,
highest percentage of Jews taken away and murdered in gas chambers, um, around 80% of the Jewish population in the Netherlands. But there were exceptions. And after the war, researchers did hundreds of interviews with these resistance heroes to find out what made them different, like what made them tick. Were they very left wing, right wing? Were they super compassionate, or were they entrepreneurial, or were they professors, or highly educated, or not at all? And they just couldn't find anything. There's this big study called the Altruistic Personality Project. It's a very big book, and at the end of the book, you see all the statistical evidence, and again, the same words pop up, the same letters, NS, NS, which means non-significant, not statistically significant. It was basically a cross section of the population. And then later, other researchers realized that it wasn't about the psychology of resistance. No, it was about the sociology of resistance. There was one factor that predicted very well whether people would join the resistance, yes or no. And this was the simple matter of being asked to join.
yeah.
In 96% of all cases, people said, yes, I can do this.
Yes.
Um, and then they started doing good things. It often started small with distributing illegal newspapers, for example, but then one thing led to the other. They joined this little cult. They were radicalized by others. And that's how you become a good person. It has very little to do with your genes,
Yeah.
with the way you were
Yeah.
raised as your parents or blah blah blah. No, it's yeah, finding a little bubble like that, then
Yeah.
inhaling it very deeply,
Right.
and then
Right.
just doing the work. Uh,
Yeah.
I can't emphasize this enough. It really does not start with some kind of meditation session, again, delving very deep into your soul. It's not how it works. Just
Yeah.
start doing the work, and you will
It's
see
yeah.
the work will transform you as a person.
And your book is making the ask, right? Right. This is
Yes.
part of what
Yes.
people have to be asked,
Yeah.
and you are asking, which is a great transition to my final question, which is about your School for Moral Ambition and what you're setting out to do. You made more money than you expected to make from Humankind, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
were kind of surprised by how successful that
Yeah.
was. And as I understand it, you're dedicating, applying a large portion of that in order to build
Yeah.
the school. And what's the mission?
Yeah. And everything I earn with this book goes into the School for Moral Ambition as well. So we like to see ourselves as the Robin Hoods of talent. We take away the talent from these big corporations, for example, and we give it to the most important causes of our time. So we're developing programs that help people to pivot their career. One program I also already mentioned briefly, it's called the Moral Ambition Circle. These are groups of 5 to 8 people who come together around these questions. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we think
Yeah.
we're asking the right questions. And so we've developed a simple curriculum, a self-facilitated program that lasts for 7 evenings. And we now have 10,000 members in more than 100
Wow.
countries.
Amazing.
It's been really cool to see this spread. It's all like small groups, right? Little cults who want to explore what moral ambition could mean for them. So everyone listening to this podcast is invited to join our community at moralambition.org. It's all for free. At the same time, we have our Moral Ambition Fellowships, and these are quite a bit harder to get into. They're highly prestigious fellowships, about a dozen people that we recruit per program. We pay them to quit their job for about 7 months, and they totally transform their career in the meantime. We are their Gandalfs, so they don't decide for themselves what they will do, but we've done extensive research into the question, okay, what are some of the most pressing issues? And we've drafted a kind of mission statement for them. We started in Europe last year uh, on 2 important cause areas. One was fighting big tobacco, which is the single most evil legal industry
Yeah.
out there today and super neglected, sadly, the work against that. And the other one is the fight for sustainable proteins, where you're basically doing multiple things at the same time. So we talked a lot about animal suffering. Well, the technological transition here to clean meat and other alternatives can do an enormous amount of good. But it's also the single largest the single most neglected part of the fight against climate change. So that's 20% of
Yes.
emissions. And then it's also about pandemic prevention. Factory farms are huge risks for the next pandemic. So yeah, a lot going on there. And yeah, we keep launching new programs. And
And
people can apply for
it's
that.
it's an elite and highly selective program. There's these fellowships.
Yes.
And how do you respond to those who criticize this elitism? I mean, that's a choice, right? You want
Yep.
this to be highly prestigious
Yeah.
and basically you want to create a high status
Yeah.
form of moral
Yeah.
ambition.
Yeah. I just want to live in a different kind of world. I
Yeah.
want to live in a world where a Harvard graduate that goes and work for McKinsey is seen as boring and silly and like not one of the best of the best. Like that should be like your C, D, E, or F option, right? But the very
Yeah.
first option should be, getting into a super prestigious program that does an enormous amount of good. That's the world I want to live in. And that's the magnet we're building right now.
Well, I'm so glad you are, Rutger. Thank you for this book, Moral Ambition, and for what you're doing with the School for Moral Ambition. I think it's amazing and such an inspiring book and conversation.
Thanks for having me.